At this point in time, we are going to start covering Chapter 6, Nutrition and Growth. Actually, I should say growth and nutrition, but we will start with our energy. I'm just going to put a capital E. And our chemical requirements. Now, when we are dealing with, okay, let me back that up. When we are dealing with a lot of organisms that are bacterial, we have to realize not all organisms will have the same requirements for energy as well as for chemicals, food source, as we would. So this is a very handy chart that goes through the typical chemical and energy requirements of most microorganisms, such as bacterial microorganisms. So when we're looking at microbial growth requirements, we have to consider three things all cells need for metabolism: a source of carbon, a source of energy, and a source of electrons or hydrogen atoms in which to provide that energy. So we're going to look at our different types of autotrophs and what we call heterotrophs. So first things first, let's look at an autotroph, and what is that? An autotroph, okay, troph, feed, auto, self. Okay, so this is something that would be considered in other standards as a producer. It's going to make its own food, so it feeds itself. It is known as a self-feeder. The other is a heterotroph. Again, troph, to feed, hetero, other. So it feeds off of other sources. So it has to get its energy source from something other than itself. So it can't be what we call photosynthetic. That would be an example of a great autotroph. We are heterotrophs. We get our energy from our food sources that we consume. Another term for this organism would be a consumer, because it has to consume its food sources. So we'll first start off with our nice little handy chart here on page 163 and look at our energy sources versus our carbon sources. So we'll have certain organisms that get their carbon source from carbon dioxide. We are an example of getting our carbon source from organic compounds. Okay, carbon dioxide, organisms that get their carbon source from carbon dioxide would be examples of photoautotrophs and chemoautotrophs. So let's take a look at the photoautotrophs first. Photo meaning light, okay, auto, self, troph, feeder. So photoautotrophs are our first ones. Let's take a look at those examples that they have. Plants, algae, cyanobacteria, all use H2O. What is H2O? Water, as an electron source to reduce carbon dioxide. And we'll talk about that a little bit further when we go into our plants using photosynthesis. Then, thus producing oxygen as a byproduct. So oxygen is their final released end product that they're going to release into the environment that's not needed. So plants, algae, and cyanobacteria would be considered photoautotrophs. Let's look at some other organisms. Green sulfur bacteria and purple sulfur bacteria. These are going to be a little different because they're using hydrogen sulfide as an electron source instead of water. And then they do not produce, as a result, they don't have the oxygen here, so they do not produce oxygen. Instead, these guys will produce sulfur as a byproduct and give it off. And a lot of times they'll turn it a different color and you'll smell it. Okay, so let's go to our next one that is going to use carbon dioxide as a carbon source. And that is those that are going to use chemical compounds as well. So those are chemoautotrophs. I'm hoping you all can see my textbook easily as well, because I'm kind of going through the textbook as I'm going along. If you're having trouble with seeing something when I'm using multiple screens, please let me know. I'm learning as I go as well, so that way we'll be able to do a better job for all of you. So we're currently on chemoautotrophs. Hydrogen, sulfur, and nitrifying bacteria would be examples of a chemoautotroph. Also, certain types of archaea bacteria, those would also be classified as chemoautotrophs. Now let's look at the ones that are going to use organic compounds as their carbon source. And their energy source will start off with the light. Those are your photoheterotrophs. Photoheterotrophs examples would be green non-sulfur bacteria, purple non-sulfur bacteria, as well as certain archaea bacteria species that are going to be considered photoheterotrophs. They use their light source, their energy source, I should say, as a light, and then they're going to use organic compounds as their chemical source, or their carbon source, I should say. Chemoheterotrophs, our last group. We are classified in this category. So maybe that'll help you. And so are a lot of organisms classified as chemoheterotrophs. Now, chemoheterotrophs, if you're in this category, there are a large number of organisms that perform aerobic respiration that are going to be in this category, and you are one of them. You perform what we call aerobic respiration. You breathe in oxygen and release carbon dioxide as a byproduct. Most animals are chemoheterotrophs, and they also perform aerobic respiration. Most fungi are also classified. Fungi, however you want to say it, it's all correct. Protozoa, remember this is the animal-like protist. Many types of bacteria perform aerobic respiration, but not all. So those will also be classified as chemoheterotrophs. Anaerobic respiration, that means they do not go through and breathe in oxygen and breathe out carbon dioxide. I shouldn't say breathe, but they're going to take in oxygen and release carbon dioxide as a byproduct in aerobic respiration. If they do not, that would be classified as anaerobic, without aerobic respiration. Some animals, very few, but some do. Protozoa, bacteria, and archaea can classify as anaerobic respiration. Also, if it is an organism that follows the process of fermentation, it will also be different and is a form of anaerobic respiration. Certain types of bacteria perform fermentation, as well as yeast, which is a fungus, and also archaea, certain archaea bacteria, depending upon the species, that are also going to be chemoheterotrophs, fall into that category. Okay, so that gets through our energy and chemical requirements in those categories. Next, we want to talk about oxygen requirements. Not all organisms are going to require oxygen. We do. However, not all organisms need oxygen. So the first one we'll look at is an obligate aerobe. Obligate, must. Oops, I have no idea why I put a B there. Aerobe, have oxygen. I'm on a roll here with the spelling. They require oxygen as the final electron acceptor of the electron transport chain. Okay, so whenever they're going through cellular respiration, they must have oxygen. And they must have it in order to be able to perform that process that's anaerobic respiration. If they don't, they cannot continue. It's very important in that aspect. Opposite would be obligate anaerobes. And means without. And if you're obligated, that means you do not have an option. You must not have the presence of oxygen. If you do, you'll die. So there are certain microbes that are obligate anaerobes, and we're going to show this when we look at our FTM tubes next week. Well, it'll be a couple of weeks before we can do that. We also have what's called facultative anaerobes. Now, a facultative anaerobe can maintain life via fermentation or any form, well, I shouldn't say any form, via fermentation or some forms of anaerobic respiration. However, they can survive in the presence of oxygen, but their efficiency, their metabolism efficiency, is going to be reduced in the absence of oxygen. So let's go ahead and take a look at this right here on page 165, figure 6.2. It says using a liquid thioglycolate growth medium to identify the oxygen requirements of organisms. So you'll look at the facultative anaerobes, and you'll see how whenever they are, I probably said that backwards. Yes, I did say that backwards. You'll notice in the absence of oxygen, there's fewer microbes. Why? Because they're not able to grow and reproduce as quickly and efficiently in the absence of oxygen. So they can live using aerobic and aerobic respiration. However, they're going to prefer the oxygenated environment. So you'll see heavier at the top and still growing some tone toward the bottom. Very common thing for a lot of bacterium to do. Now, some are what we call aerotolerant. That's the one here on this very far side. On the far right, D, aerotolerant anaerobes. You'll notice how they're spread evenly throughout the medium because they really do not care if they have oxygen or not. They use aerobic metabolism, but can tolerate, they do not use aerobic metabolism. So they don't use oxygen at all. However, they can tolerate the presence of oxygen because here's a crazy thing. Oxygen is actually very toxic to a lot of organisms. They have to have special enzymes to break it down. So these are what we call aerotolerant microbes. They can live in the presence of oxygen. However, they don't really care whether they're not present or not, whether oxygen is present or not. So they're aerotolerant. Now there's another really special group called microaerophils. I don't know if we have a picture of those or not. Let me look. There's not one here. But microaerophils love it to have low oxygen concentrations. They can't live in a high oxygen environment. There's my top of my FTM. And they can't live in no oxygen. So they're going to grow right here where it's between 2 and 10% oxygen concentration. They can't live where it's too high of oxygen, and they can't live where it's too low of oxygen. So you'll see this very specific 2 to 10% oxygen ratio. So those are our different types of organisms that are going to live in oxygen or non-oxygenated requirements. I will talk a little bit more when we do our labs concerning the toxins that are associated with oxygen. There are 4 forms of oxygen that are toxic, one of which is singlet. I'm just going to put O2, singlet oxygen. Another is superoxide radicals, which this is what I will specifically talk about later. Thirdly is your peroxide anions. And then we have your hydroxyl radicals. Those are your 4 types of toxic oxygen, forms of oxygen that are toxic. So next, let's go on into our nitrogen requirements. Nitrogen is a growth limiting factor or a growth limiting nutrient for a lot of organisms. If you don't make enough nitrogen, for example, or I shouldn't say you don't make enough, if you don't consume enough nitrogen, you're not going to be able to put on protein. No protein, no muscles. So that's a very important thing for us as well. Here's the craziest thing. How much nitrogen do you think comes from the atmosphere? Well, we use none. However, whenever you breathe it in, the atmosphere has 79% raw nitrogen. There are very, very few organisms that can take this nitrogen here and use it. Those that can do that can perform a process we know as nitrogen fixation. There are very specialized types of bacterium that can go through this process and do what we call fixed nitrogen. Now, what are they doing? They're taking nitrogen in the raw elemental form and they're going to go through a series of steps and make it something that other organisms can use, ammonia. They fix it and they will be able to give it off as an ammonium compound. Now, ammonium compounds can then be used by plants, animals, things of that nature. So there's a number of bacterium that go through a process known as nitrogen, I am getting ahead of myself, nitrogen fixation that can take nitrogen in its raw form from the atmosphere, go through a series of steps that's known as the nitrogen cycle. I'm just going to go ahead and put that there. I'm not going through the whole cycle. And in those steps, they're basically taking the raw form of nitrogen and putting it into, giving it off as ammonia. Now, there's a number of other chemical growth factors. I really don't talk too much about those. What I'm going to do is break this up and we'll talk about temperature, physical effects of water, and things of that nature in my last segment for this chapter.